She was 20 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. On the morning of April the 14th, 1887, Eleanor May Whitfield stood on the limestone porch of her uncle's house in Prescott, Arizona Territory, with one carpetbag, one folded quilt, and the sum of $2,300 in her pocketbook, a settlement meant to be the final accounting of her mother's younger sister. The last ledger entry of a debt the Whitfield family had chosen to consider paid. The rejection had been a sentence long and a wedding band wide. Her cousin Rosalind had been formally engaged to a Mr. Victor Hargrove of the Territorial Bank, and the household, as her uncle had put it in his dry, ledger-paper voice, required proportion to its new circumstances. What no one in that stilted parlor knew, what no one in Prescott suspected as Eleanor stepped off the porch and into the warm mud of Whiskey Row, was that she carried, sewn into the lining of her coat, a small brass engineer's compass that had belonged to her late father, and that the needle of that compass, defective as it was, swung always toward the south, as if pointing toward a thing it could not name. That compass would, in 8 days' time, point toward the dried bed of the old Colorado and a stranded steamship called the Lady Marguerite, which she would, on the advice of a handbill and the recklessness of her grief, purchase for the sum of $847 in back taxes. Settle in wherever you are. Her name was Eleanor May Whitfield. And what she was about to find inside the bones of that ship would take her breath away, and almost break her heart. Her father had been Edwin Aldous Whitfield, a steam engineer out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who had come west in 1872 to survey mineral lines for the Central Arizona Railway and had stayed, against the advice of his older brother Tobias, because the desert had a quality he called the hospitable silence of a workable problem. He had smelled of boiler grease and pipe tobacco, his hands had been perpetually warm, even in January, from the small forge he kept in the back of their rented adobe, and his voice, which Eleanor could still summon at will, had the unhurried cadence of a man who read blueprints the way other men read novels. He had taught her to read schematics before she could read novels, to see, in the cross-section of a steam cylinder, an argument more elegant than any sermon. A machine does not lie, Ellie, he had told her one winter evening in 1879. And the man who speaks the language of a machine will never be wholly at the mercy of a man who speaks only the language of a ledger. He had died in the autumn of 1882 when a pressure valve on a contracted survey rig failed and gave him, in the time it takes a kettle to scream, the contents of the boiler back into his chest. He had been 38. He had left her the brass compass and a single sentence of parting wisdom that he had scratched in pencil on the inside of a folded Union Pacific timetable: "Find me in the work, Ellie. I will be there." Her mother, Caroline Susanna Whitfield, had died 3 years earlier in the summer of 1879, not of any single dramatic cause but of the slow desert fever that took so many newcomers in those years, and what Eleanor remembered of her now was less a face than a scent. The faint, powdery sweetness of dried lavender her mother had kept in a tin on the windowsill, and the exact feel of her mother's thumb pressing softly across Eleanor's knuckles when she was afraid. After Edwin's death, Tobias Whitfield had taken Eleanor into his Prescott home, not out of affection, he had never pretended as much, but out of what he termed, in his agrarian way, the family's reciprocal obligation. Tobias was a commission merchant and a man of cold arithmetic. He believed the world ran on ledgers and that every human relationship was, at base, a transaction awaiting its proper column. He had given Eleanor a corner room, a weekly allowance of 75 cents, and a sequence of chores ranging from the washing of windows to the copying out of his ledgers by candlelight. And so Eleanor grew into a peculiar and useful creature. By day she mastered the cold syntax of Tobias's books: debits, credits, accounts receivable, the small incantations of the mercantile world that drove Prescott. By night, when the house had gone quiet and only the coyotes spoke, she studied her father's schematics by lamplight, taught herself the geometry of pressure valves and the patience of circular saw work, and held the brass compass to the candle to watch its needle drift south toward the impossible promise of a thing she could not yet name. Two contrasting worldviews, she understood even then, the ledger book of profit and loss, and the elegant logic of a machine. The reason for her dismissal had been a wedding. Rosalind, Tobias's elder daughter, was to marry Victor Hargrove of the Territorial Bank on the 9th of May, 1887, and the household's new proportion required the dismissal, with appropriate settlement, of one superfluous female dependent. Tobias delivered the news across his counting desk on the morning of April 14, without sitting Eleanor down, without once raising his eyes from the ledger he was annotating, and without any arrangement of his voice that would suggest the conversation was anything other than a routine billing matter. "The Hargroves have made clear," he said, in a clipped monotone, "that the establishment of their new household does not admit of a niece of indeterminate occupation." He paused only to dip his pen. "We have arranged $2,300. We consider this generous." Eleanor received the figures, the Standard, and the Settle House, all with the posture of a daughter who had been raised to hear news in a study and to keep her face. "I accept the terms, uncle," she said, in a single flat sentence, and there was no quaver in it and no curtsy. She went upstairs and packed her carpetbag in the order her mother had taught her, stockings flat, dresses folded into thirds. The small pearl-handled brush from her mother's dressing table wrapped in linen, and she chose also to take 3 other modest things, her father's brown leather notebook of schematics, the half-finished sweater she had been knitting for Rosalind's trousseau, and the cracked tintype of her mother and father taken in 1875 outside the Packer shanty. She did not take the tintype of Eleanor herself that had always stood on the parlor mantel, because she noticed, with the silent eye of a girl who had long ago learned not to miss absences, that it had been removed already. The brass compass she kept, by long habit, in the inner pocket of her coat. She closed the bedroom door behind her with the soft, deliberate click of a woman who had been taught, by long use, to leave a room without slamming it. She left Prescott at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 14th by Wells Fargo stage for the run south to Wickenburg, and then on, by changing conveyance twice, to the dried hamlet of Last Bend, where, 8 days later, on the 22nd of April, the second-hand pinch of a lettered handbill nailed to the side of a feed store caught her eye. The journey had been 9 days in all and had cost her $19 in fares and $11 in lodging, leaving her with $2,269. A sunburn across the bridge of her nose, and the persistent impression of dust as a taste, red clay in the back of the throat, alkali grit between the teeth, the faint chalk of dry wind on the tongue. She had slept in 3 different rooms above 3 different livery stables, had been pressed against the shoulder of a Swede peddler who had chewed tobacco in his sleep, and had spent one entirely cold night in a sandstone way station between Congress and the missing ranch where the wind had come down out of the Bradshaw Range like a flat blade. She had not, in any of those days, wept. She had allowed herself instead the small consolations of arithmetic, 3 figures credited, 3 figures debited. A running balance kept penciled on the back of her father's old timetable, and the quiet, slow reiteration of a maxim she had composed on the second night, by candlelight. In the margins of the same timetable, one cannot truly lose what one never possessed. Last Bend was a town of 203 souls and 207 dogs, set down on the cracked clay of what had once, before the great drought of '76, been the bottom of the Colorado River's western branch. The river had not run here in 11 years. The town smelled, at all hours, of red dust and the iron filings of the abandoned stamp mills. Its main street went east-west along a single 70-foot shelf of dried sand and ended, both east and west, in the unmistakable geometry of abandonment, a broken corral, a tin-roofed assay office with a door hanging on one hinge, 3 or 4 false-fronted houses whose second stories had rotted into nothing. And in the middle of the town, canted slightly to starboard against the high south bank, half buried in the silt of a vanished channel, sat the Lady Marguerite, a 4-deck stern-wheel steamship of approximately 180 feet in length and 28 in beam. Painted, where paint remained, the faded teal of a long-forgotten river freight line, its pilothouse still intact, its twin smokestacks still standing, its starboard paddle wheel half exposed above the silt like the rib bones of a beached whale. It was, in the dry light of that afternoon, an absurd, magnificent, utterly abandoned thing, and Eleanor, walking up to it across the dusty hummock of what had once been a levee, felt a pull in her chest that was neither sentiment nor pity but the pure mechanical recognition of one forgotten thing by another. A forgotten ledger entry, she thought, watching the afternoon light lay copper across the pilothouse glass, just like her. The lord of the Lady Marguerite, in 1887, was a retired cattle buyer named Phineas Grover who doubled as the unpaid clerk of the Last Bend Irrigation District and, in that latter capacity, the official custodian of the county's tax arrears. He was a small, dry man of about 65 who wore a celluloid collar in all weathers and who received Eleanor's request to purchase the ship with the mild, unmoved disbelief of a man who has seen every sort of fool cross his counter and has been disappointed, on every occasion, by the category's poor performance. "The Marguerite," he said, drawing the back taxes ledger toward him with 2 fingers, "is carried on the rolls of Yavapai County as taxable personal property at $112.50 per annum, of which arrears there stand 8.5 years. Compounded at 6%, for a sum total of $847.12. Which the district is prepared to accept in lawful tender of the United States for the conveyance of the vessel, her tackle, and her appurtenances, in their current condition, as is, where is, and to whom it may forever concern." Eleanor counted out, from the inner pocket of her coat, $847 in crisp Prescott National Bank notes and 12 cents in 2 nickels and 2 pennies, and laid them on the counter in a single careful stack. Grover looked at the money, then at Eleanor, then at the money again. He shrugged, a shrug of pure, settled, mineral disbelief, and, after 2 hours of sanding the ink bottle back to life and pressing a wax seal of the territorial courthouse into a brittle deed of transfer, handed her a folded parchment that smelled of dust and lamp oil and that entitled her, in the formal language of the Arizona Territory, to the full and unimpaired ownership of a stranded steamship, her tackle, and her appurtenances. "Good luck to you, miss," he said, and the tone was neither blessing nor curse but the dry, stony blessing of a man who had ceased to expect that luck would settle its accounts in this county. The Lady Marguerite, viewed up close, was both smaller and larger than she had appeared from the levee, smaller because one always confuses length with grandeur, and larger because the dust inside was thick as a gray blanket, 2 inches deep on the flat surfaces of the social deck and 4 inches deep on the floor of the crew's quarters aft. Eleanor entered through the stern cargo port, which still swung on its original hinges, and walked forward through the sequence of public rooms, the main salon with its sprung parquet and its velvet settees gone to powder, the gentlemen's card room with 1 green baize table still standing on its 3 sound legs, the ladies' retiring room with a single porcelain comb still resting on a cracked marble shelf, until she reached, at the forward end of the main deck, the broad iron staircase that descended into the steam room itself. 2 decks down, behind the sealed bulkhead of the engine compartment, she found the Harriet Farquhar compound engine, 18 tons of iron and brass, mounted on its original keelbolts. Frozen in its last working position of 1876, its cylinder heads uncracked, its flywheel true, its crankpin unbroken. The boiler, when she tapped it with her father's brass compass, rang back at her in the pure, sustained, alto tone of an intact pressure vessel, the very tone, she would say later, of a held breath and a held promise and a machine that had never, in its 11 years of neglect, forgotten the elegant logic of its own design. It was, she wrote in her father's notebook that night, fundamentally sound, a home waiting to be awakened. She chose, on the first night, to sleep in the small forward cabin that had once been the captain's day room, a timber-walled chamber of perhaps 14 by 16 feet whose 2 stern ports still held their glass and whose iron stove, though rusted at the flue, stood square on its original hearthstone. The first week she spent, by her penciled calendar, in sweeping, 18 hours of it, the dust rising in low gray tides and settling on her hair and in the creases of her cotton gloves. The second week she spent in mending, a square of oilcloth tacked across the most starred of the stern ports. A length of telegraph wire from the local assay office wired into the cabin's broken latch, a coil of jute twine used to bind the sprung parquet of the main salon into a serviceable floor. The third week she brought in, at the cost of $7 from her diminishing balance, a 40-pound sack of pinyon beans, a tin of salt pork, 3 gallons of river still water carried by mule from the well at Castle Rock, 11 miles distant. The nearest water for 50 miles in any direction, and a small cast-iron skillet whose handle she had to wrap, by the second week of use, in a doubled strip of rawhide. Water she rationed, marking each gallon with a penciled tick on the cabin wall, 2 gallons for cooking, 1 for washing, 1 held in reserve. On the 28th evening she lit, for the first time in 11 years within the walls of the Lady Marguerite, a small fire in the captain's day-room stove. And the smell of pinyon beans and salt pork, and the small yellow square of stove light on the timber wall, struck her, she would remember, as the first proper pocket of civilization she had made for herself since leaving Prescott. But there was one room aboard the Marguerite that resisted her. The purser's office, a tight, brass-fitted chamber of perhaps 10 by 12 feet on the starboard side of the forward deck. Just abaft the captain's day room, was sealed with a Chubb lock of a quality Eleanor had never encountered outside of the Prescott Territorial Bank. Its door was oak, 2 inches thick, and its brass escutcheon was stamped with the inscription C. Hadley, Purser, Confidential. Her father's schematic notebook had taught her the rudiments of lockwork, the 6-pin tumbler, the ward cut, the lift and drag, but this was a Chubb of 7 levers and a false gate. An English instrument of such fastidious cruelty that the very look of it seemed to imply that its owner had expected, and wished to discourage. Exactly the sort of attention Eleanor was now paying it. She spent, by her own penciled count across 2 afternoons, 4 hours with her kit of bent wires and tension tools, and failed. The false gate, time and again, swallowed her pick and rejected it, and when, on the second afternoon, she paused to listen, she could hear the soft, mechanical, almost breathing hum of 7 precision levers refusing, with immense patience, to cooperate. She abandoned the pick on the third morning and turned, instead, to the slow, brute patience of dismantling, a jeweler's screwdriver in one hand, her father's brass compass in the other, and the pin-pressed hinge of the lock mechanism as her point of entry. She removed the faceplate, lifted the lever pack out by its mounting screws, and spent 41 minutes, she had counted them, by the cabin clock, in unscrewing, prying, and prying again, until her knuckles were raw, her wrists were trembling, and the brass had left a small clean wound across the ball of her right thumb. At the end of the 41st minute the lever pack came free in her hand, and the door swung inward on a creak of oak that had not been heard, she guessed, in 11 years. The room that opened was stale in the way only unbreathed rooms can be stale, a smell of dried ink, of old paper, of tobacco ghosts, and contained, in a single tableau that the dust had preserved with the fidelity of a lacquer, a roll-top desk of solid walnut, a brass-handled spittoon, an empty inkwell, a coal-oil lamp with its chimney still in place, and, lying open across the desk's soft leather top, a bound logbook with its pages still crisp at the edges. The logbook was the daybook of one Cornelius Hadley, purser of the Lady Marguerite, in continuous service from her launching in 1868 through her final mooring in 1876. And his entries over those 9 years traced, with the clipped, first-person precision of a working man, the slow, geological decline of the river she had been built to serve. The water had fallen, year, by inches and then by feet. The cotton cargoes had dwindled to 2 in 1874 and to none in 75. The passenger list had shrunk from 68 souls in 70 to 9 in 75, and the entries, which had begun with the brisk procedural diction of a man who loved his work, had softened, year by year, into a tone Eleanor could not bring herself to read aloud. The final entry, dated the 8th of November, 1876, read in full, moorings held. Crew discharged. Boiler drained. I remain aboard until I am relieved, or until the river returns, whichever God shall first permit. There is no money for relief. There is no God. There is the river, if it ever comes back. ch. 2 days after that entry, in the same cramped hand and the same dim ink, Hadley had added a single line. "The river has not come back." Eleanor read the entry twice and set the book down with the handling of a woman who understood, by then, that she was holding the last breath of a man she would never meet. She did not weep. She examined, instead, with the care her father had taught her, the desk itself, the grain of the walnut against the grain of the deckboards beneath. The slight, and only slight, depression in the floor of the right-hand drawer, the careful thickness of the drawer bottom against the thickness of the drawer sides. She tapped the drawer front with the back of her father's compass. The sound was not wood but, beneath a 1/8-inch false panel, the unmistakable dry rattle of metal on metal. She pressed in, with her thumb, on the joint where drawer front met drawer side. The panel came away. She had pressed, she would recall, at exactly the spot a man of Cornelius Hadley's habits would have chosen, the third countersunk screw from the back. On the right-hand side, and beneath it lay, in a small brass strongbox of the kind sold at the Prescott stationers, the following, $2,400 in U.S. gold pieces, the coins bearing dates from 1868 to 1876, a small chamois pouch containing a gold wedding band of plain design, and a folded sheet of foolscap sealed with red laboratory wax, by the impression of a signet ring whose device Eleanor did not at first recognize. The letter inside the seal was addressed, in a steady but older hand than the logbooks, "Tio whomever finds this," and signed by Cornelius Hadley himself. Hadley explained, in 4 pages of plain language, that he had lost his wife Marin to the river fever of '72 and his daughters Ruth and Christiana to the same fever, 11 months later. In the cabin of the Marguerite herself, that he had stayed aboard the vessel after every other crewman had gone ashore because he could not bear, in any other place, the silence of a house without them, that he had served the river for 9 years and that the river's drying was the death of the only life he had wished to keep, and that he had saved, in the 11 years since her mooring, the entire sum of $2,400 in wages he had refused to draw, refusing, as he put it, to take from the world what I could not in good conscience put back. "The money," he wrote, "I leave to whomever has the patience, the eye, and the vision to find value in what everyone else has abandoned." He had written further that the gold wedding band in the chamois pouch had belonged to Marin, and that he had wished it to stay, if it could, aboard the Marguerite. "If you find this, and if you are a person of conscience," he concluded, "remember that we were here, and that the river did not forget us even if it forgot to come back." Eleanor read the letter through twice. She did not read it a third time, because a third reading would have been, she understood, an act of trespass. She set the wedding band, gently, back into its pouch. She placed the strongbox, with its gold, on the desk. She sat, for a long while, in the captain's day room, with the brass compass in her left hand and the chamois pouch in her right, and she thought, with the quiet, almost audible precision of a machine in equilibrium, of her father, who had given her a compass, and of Cornelius Hadley, who had given her the rest of a life's work and a ring that had never been hers to keep. One had been a guide to the elegant logic of a machine. The other was a reminder that the world's abandoned things were, almost always, the world's worth keeping. She made her decision, that night, in ink and on the same foolscap Hadley had used, she would stay. She would spend the money not on travel back east but on the resurrection of the Lady Marguerite as something useful, and she would honor both of the men who had trusted her to find it. The plan she drew up, over the next 3 evenings, in the precise schematic hand her father had taught her, was a dual-purpose one. The Marguerite, she decided, would become first, a way station inn for the travelers, freighters, and prospectors who even now crossed the empty bed of the old Colorado on the route between Wickenburg and the southern mines, and second, the only repair shop of any kind for 50 miles in any direction, a forge and engine works in the steamer's forward hold, where the broken boilers, the buckled wagon axles, and the cracked pressure cookers of the desert settlements could be set right by a woman who had, in her own quiet way, been an engineer since she was 11. The first supply run, on the morning of May the 3rd, took her to the last Bend Mercantile with a specific list, 80 feet of 1x6 pine planking at 4 cents the foot. 2 gallons of boiled linseed oil, a square yard of cotton canvas for patching, 20 pounds of 10-penny nails, a 5-pound box of blacksmith's coal, a coil of number 9 annealed wire, and a small grindstone imported, according to the merchant, all the way from San Francisco for some reason nobody ever asked. The townspeople gathered on the veranda of the Last Bend Hotel to watch a young woman purchase strap hinges and plumber's solder in mid-morning, offered no encouragement and asked no questions. By her second supply run, on the 15th of May, they had begun to nod. By her third, on the 1st of June, 2 of them had offered to carry her lumber. Over the course of that first summer she completed, in sequence, 3 discrete repair projects whose technical details she had drawn out in her father's notebook before the first swing of the hammer. The first was the weatherproofing of the salon deck, a careful scraping, a coat of boiled linseed oil thinned 1 to 3 with turpentine, and a fitted overlay of 1x6 pine sealed, plank by plank, against the deck rails with plumber's putty and 10-penny nails driven at a 6-inch pitch. The second was the caulking of the port side hull at the waterline, a 2-band rope affair, for days' work, her hands gray with the oakum by the end of each afternoon, which had the effect on the small community, of demonstrating that a woman could read a hull the way her father had read a boiler. The third, and largest, was the rebuild of the secondary boiler, 43 rivets reset. 2 cracked firebox plates replaced with rolled plates she had ordered from the Phoenix Iron Works at a cost of $26, and a hand-fitted gasket of her own design that she had cut by trial, from a sheet of half-inch gum rubber. Each project, when it concluded, was met by a small crowd of Last Bend citizens who had begun, by the end of July, to refer to the Marguerite not by her given name but by Eleanor's. And as the summer passed, 3 of them in particular came, uninvited, to help. The first was Abel Calloway, a retired wheelwright of 70, who had come aboard on the second afternoon of her weatherproofing, had watched silently from the salon door for 4 hours, had offered a single flat test, "Show me, girl, what you do if that plank split at the join," and, on her correct answer, had walked to his house, returned with his personal tool chest, and accepted the wages she offered him, $1 a day and his meals, with the brief remark, "I'll be here at 6. The second was Ruth Bellamy, the widowed baker of Last Bend, who began, on the first morning of June, to leave a small muslin-wrapped loaf and a tin of cooled coffee on the capstan of the main deck at 5:30 every morning without comment and without knock. And who accepted, when she was finally asked, only the formal title of ship's cook, and the same wage of $1 a day Abel had accepted. The third was a young blacksmith named Joaquim Reyes, 26, who had lost his own father to the same sort of pressure valve accident that had killed hers, and who, on the morning he watched her set the secondary boiler's gasket with her own hands, crossed the deck in 3 strides, held out his hand, and said, in the quiet, slightly asthmatic voice of a young man who knew exactly what he had seen, "Your father taught you to read a man as well as a machine, didn't he?" It was not friendship in the conventional sense. It was, rather, the slow accretion of a community organized around the deliberate reuse of work that no one else in the territory had thought worth keeping. The months turned into a year. By the spring of 1888 the Lady Marguerite was no longer stranded in the public imagination, she was the gleaming, low-sung center of a settlement that had begun, very quietly, to revive around her. Her hull had been recaulked twice and repainted in the 2-color scheme Eleanor had chosen, a deep oxide red below the waterline and a soft but pitch-resistant ivory above. Her pilot house had been glazed with a proper set of window lights imported, at a cost of $41, from a glazier in Phoenix. Her name, freshly relettered in gilt across the stern in a clear, slightly Arabic hand Eleanor had taught herself from her father's drawings. Now read the Marguerite INN and Engine Works, a compound name that signaled, to anyone with eyes to read the territory, both purposes of the resurrected vessel in 2 economical words. She was known, by the end of that first year, by a nickname that traveled on every wagon tongue and freight bill in the southern county. Miss Eleanor's Lady. The particular class of guests who arrived, a Boston-bound mining engineer who had lost, on the trail, the throat of his transit. A Methodist circuit rider whose buckboard spring had cracked twice in one afternoon, a Mrs. Adelaide Forsyth of the Wickenburg boarding school, who had come down with the typhoid and required 3 days of careful cool water compresses, were, each in their own small way, the first notarized witnesses to the fact that the dry bed of the old Colorado was no longer a place one merely crossed through. The daily life of the Marguerite, and this was the daily life that held, in its quiet repetitions, the true measure of her rebuilding, now ran on the precision of the steam engine clock she had reinstalled in the pilot house. She rose at 5, she took her coffee, delivered by Ruth, in the same small tin, to the same capstan, at 5:30 of every morning. At the capstan, she swept the salon by 6. She lit the salon stove by 6:15, she took her breakfast, 1 soft-boiled egg, half a loaf of Ruth's bread, 1 cup of black coffee, at her father's roll-top desk in the purser's office by 6:45, she opened the inn's front gangway at 7. Abel Calloway arrived at 6 every morning to review the day's work and to teach, in the evenings, the local boys the apprentice trade of wheelwrighting. Ruth Bellamy ran the galley at the stern and produced, with the calm formality of an old ship's cook, 3 meals a day for any traveler who could pay or any traveler who could not. Joaquim Reyes ran the engine works in the forward hold and, by the second spring, had begun to teach a hired apprentice of his own, a 16-year-old boy named Henry Akers whose grandfather had also, it turned out, known the pressure valve by an intimate name. The Marguerite was no longer a way station, it was the social and economic heart of Last Bend. And on Sunday afternoons, weather permitting, Eleanor would open the salon to the children of the settlements for an hour of instruction in the geometry of gears, and she would give them, in their small oil-blackened hands, the same gift her father had once given her, the first clean sight of a machine that does not lie. It was on a quiet evening in the early spring of 1889, by her penciled calendar, the 28th of March, that Eleanor May Whitfield, at 22 years of age, sat alone in the purser's office, in the low yellow light of the coal oil lamp she had reinstalled on its original bracket, and let herself think about the 2 years that had passed since the morning of April 14, 1887. The roll-top desk was clear, the logbook was closed, the strongbox was relocked and its $2,400 reinvested, by her precise pencil, in the second-year capital of the inn and works. On the desk, in the lamp's small circle of warm light, lay 2 objects side by side, the brass engineer's compass that had belonged to her father, and the plain gold wedding band of Marin Hadley, which she kept, by Cornelius Hadley's written wish, aboard the Marguerite. The compass, she understood now, had been a guide to the elegant logic of a machine. The wedding band was a reminder of a man's promise to a woman he had lost, and of a settlement he had not, in the end, been willing to break. She thought, then, of her uncle Tobias, in his counting house in Prescott, with his ledger and his celluloid collar and the slow, civic, cumulative arithmetic of a man who believed the entire world could be settled into columns, and she felt, sitting there, no bitterness toward him, and no ill will. She thought of what he could not, from his desk, have imagined, that the niece of indeterminate occupation he had dismissed with $2,300 of his cold generosity had, in 8 days, walked into the bones of an abandoned steamship with $847 in her pocket, and had bought, with that money, not a vessel and not a deed but a life. She thought of her cousin Rosalind's wedding, that May of 1887, which she had not, in fact, attended, and of which she had heard, in the 3rd year, only the remote, ledger-shaped report, and she thought of her own small parcel of the world, in which a brass compass pointed south toward the dried bed of a river that had chosen, for its own reasons, to come back as people rather than as water. The lamplight lay warm on the 2 objects, and the silence of the purser's office was the silence of a machine properly at rest. She set the compass down, gently, at the left of the desk. She set the wedding band down, gently, at the right. And she thought, with the slow, even, almost audible arithmetic of a life that had been quietly settled into a column of its own. It had been the best $847 she had ever spent. It had bought her more than a home, it had bought her a life.